Hi and welcome to this session on using CSS. I'm David Wilson and I will be your presenter. This video is the second in a series of videos in the introduction to full stack development. Before we begin, let's first outline our objectives. First, we want to gain an understanding of the basics of CSS. We want to apply the CSS to the HTML elements, assuming a basic knowledge of HTML. And we want to create a visually styled web page. What we need to start is a web browser and a text editor. A web browser could be either Google Chrome or Microsoft Edge, or if we're using the text editor of Visual Studio Code, we could add an extension called Live Server, which will provide an online web browser. So what is CSS? CSS is an acronym for Cascading Style Sheets and is the language used to style web pages. It tells the browser how the elements of the web pages are to be presented. And so, together, they can produce an attractive and functional web page. So how do we add CSS to our HTML? Well, there are three ways. The first way is directly into an HTML statement. In the example, you can see is that we have a paragraph HTML. The opening tag, the P tag, I've included a style and we said that this style is equal to color of blue. This gives a fairly limited style to only that one paragraph, and therefore to try and style a web page would result in hundreds of different styles applied to individual HTML statements. So this particular version would not be recommended. The next one is to have a style tag within the HTML. You can see in the example that inside the head section of your HTML, I've included a style tag, an opening and closing. And within the style tag, you can then include all your CSS statements that you wish to apply. Again, in the example, I have indicated that a paragraph will have a color blue. In doing so, this would imply that all paragraphs would have a color of blue. Again, one version that is sometimes used. However, it does limit your style to that one particular HTML page. The third alternative, and possibly the preferred alternative, is to link your style sheet to your HTML. And so within the head section of your HTML, we would add then a link, and that link would refer to a file. In our case, we've called it formstyle.css. And within that file, we would have then all the CSS that we wish to use. The advantage of doing this is that we could apply these styles to any of our HTML and not just the one style that we saw in the previous style tag version. So what does a CSS statement look like? Well, it's made up of four parts. The first part is the selector. This is the HTML element selector, and in our case we're showing it as an H1. Then we would have the properties that we would like to apply to this selector. In our case, we're talking about a color and we're talking about a text align. And then we give the value of these properties. In our case, we want to say that the color would be yellow and the text align would be center. And then we connect them all up within the curly brackets, and hence that becomes then what is recognized as a CSS statement. Selectors are used to declare which part of the HTML elements a style would apply to. And a selector can be one of 4 different types that we will look at. The first is a tag selector, next an ID selector, then a class selector, and then an attribute selector. So we'll look at each one in turn. The first one then is a tag selector and is used to specify a style for an element in the HTML. This is what we have seen in some of our previous examples. In this example, we're looking at applying style to an H1 and H3. And you can see from the example that H1 then is a heading of property insurance application. The H3 is the GDC Insurance Limited. And then the H5 is another heading of agent. If we wish to apply style, then we can identify the particular tags, in this case H1 and H3, and then look at the property and the value. And in our case, we're going to look at text align as being center and the color as being red. And note the use of the semicolon at the end of each of the CSS statements. The result of which is that we then get a outcome based on our CSS. Next, we'll look at an ID selector, and this is used to specify a style for a single unique element. The ID selector uses the keyword ID, followed then by the name that you wish to give this ID selector. And when we want to refer to an ID selector in CSS, we use a hash symbol. So in the example given here, we've got 2 paragraphs. The first paragraph, we've included an ID selector. ID is equal to para1. And then in our CSS, we've identified that the ID would be then hash para1. And then we've identified the type of CSS we wish to use. Text align center and color as red. And when we apply both of these here, we get the following. Next is a class selector. And a class selector is used to specify a style for a group of elements. So this allows us to set a particular style for HTML elements with the same class attribute. The class selector uses the HTML element class attribute, the keyword class, and then is defined in CSS as a dot or a period. So in the example you can see is that we have identified H1 as having a class name of center, and also the paragraph, the P tab, as having the same class name. In our CSS, our class is now identified using the period, followed then by the name of the class, and then the particular style that we want to apply. So if we work between these two, we would then get the following. And then finally, we'll have a look at the attribute selector. The use of the attribute selector allows us to target HTML element input elements, such as a text box or a numeric box. In the example, you can see as we have a text box for enter your name, and that the input type has been declared as text. When we come then to use CSS, we would then use input, and inside the square brackets, we would then identify the type. In our case, type is equal to text. Within the curly brackets, we then outline what CSS we want. In our case, we're saying that the font size would be 26 pixels. And you can see by the output there that the input box now is larger, and that we can therefore identify the text much easier as 26 pixels. Each CSS line that includes properties and values is called a declaration, and a style can include several declarations, and each pair is separated from one another by the use of semicolons. And in the example you can see is that for the tag of a button we have 9 different declarations using padding, color, background color, etc. And each one of them is separated by the semicolon.